Welcome to Chiedza CheAfrica Podcast, Miss Palesa. How are you today?
I'm doing amazing. Thank you yourself, Yasha.
I'm good, thanks. Just to start off, can you introduce yourself and share a quick snapshot of your journey from South Africa to working as a global dispatcher?
My name is Palesa Khoza. I am from South Africa, born and bred, and I'm a Johannesburg girl. My journey in aviation started officially in 2014. And for the longest time, I was a flight instructor, and my passion to explore the aviation industry from a non-commercial aviation perspective is what drove me to becoming a global dispatcher. So the role in and of itself is a means to an end, so to speak, because the goal as a global dispatcher in this case is to eventually fly for the company I'm working for as a business jet, or rather business aviation pilot. And that's how I ended up as a global dispatcher.
That's amazing. So what sparked your love for aviation growing up in South Africa? Was there a defining moment that set you on this path?
Genuinely speaking, the defining moment was when I was 5 or 6 years old. I genuinely cannot remember the exact age, but I remember distinctively seeing a South African Airways Boeing 747 take off from Jan Smuts International, what is now known as OR Tambo International. And I mean, back then, the security was very relaxed. You had more access to viewing the aircrafts than what we do now. Now, obviously, because of bomb threats and 9/11 having happened, the access to seeing aircrafts in a much closer perspective has been closed off quite a bit. So my defining moment definitely was as a 6-year-old at the airport, witnessing this massive piece of metal get off the ground and get airborne. And I mean, if you've seen a Boeing 747, it's queen of the skies for a reason.
That's amazing. So we're just going to look back at the background and the early journey and dwell on that for a bit. So take us back to your roots. How did your upbringing in South Africa shape your ambitions in a field like aviation, which isn't accessible to everyone? You were 6. That's not even today. A 6-year-old doesn't know this airport in some parts of the world. So yes,
that is so true. That is very true. In hindsight, I can definitely say that I've been very privileged, because initially, or rather growing up, my assumption was always that anybody and everybody is exposed to airports, anybody and everybody is exposed to air travel, for one. And the older I got, the more I realized that not everybody has access to air travel, for one, even if it's flying locally within the country that they're born in. Not everybody has the access to take off from one province to another, or even get to a point where they're able to access the airport. So in my case, I can genuinely say I grew up more privileged than everybody else. I can't say I was rich or that I had better financial stability. Perhaps in hindsight, once again, that's what led to being able to have access to aviation. But my background specifically, what led me to being able to be exposed to aviation as much as I have been, is that my grandmother, when she finally realized that I had a deep interest in aviation, she made it a point to take me to air shows as frequently as she could. And fortunately, around the early 2000s, there was a big drive in South Africa to get more and more people exposed to the aviation industry. So whenever she would watch the news, which is something all old people do quite often, and I'm embarrassed to say that I don't do it as much. Old people had a tenacity for watching the news. So whenever she would read the newspaper or watch the news, she'd come across air shows, and the Waterkloof Air Show, the SANDF Air Show in Swartkops. When she would come across those, she'd make it an effort to try and encourage me and take me to the air shows. And whenever we were at the air shows, the most beautiful thing would happen is that you'd have stalls from South African Airways, you'd have stalls from SA Express, which is a former airline in South Africa, you'd have stalls from Mango. And the beauty of it all is that those stalls would always have a pilot from those airlines. And so you'd get to witness somebody wearing the uniform and get to be exposed to realize what it's like. Like we mentioned earlier, not everybody has access to an airport. And even when you are at the airport, it doesn't necessarily indicate or insinuate that you'd see pilots. So going to air shows is something that got me closer to realizing that it is possible, because some of the air shows I would encounter black pilots, and for everything, representation really is such an important thing. And I think the biggest turning moment was when my grandmother realized that the first black female South African pilot, Asnath Mahapa, was going to be attending one of the air shows. We sort of made it a point and a commitment to force ourselves to get to that air show. I must say, I didn't really see her on that particular day, but South African Airways had a couple of pilots that were there in the uniform that were represented, that were a good representation for myself. And from there, the journey just, it never stopped.
Wow, amazing, amazing. I love how your family actually, supported you and made this a reality when they saw, because when the bug hits you, that is all you need is support.
Definitely.
So what were some of the first steps you took to pursue a career in aviation? Were there specific schools, programs, or mentors that helped you get started?
Yes, they definitely were. What is very less known about my journey, particularly, I mean, myself and you have spoken about this ad nauseum. We have conversations about my aviation journey every now and again. What is very less known about me is that when I was in high school, the first place I started to apply was the Air Force. And I had made it a point and a decision that I wanted to be a pilot before anything else. But when I realized the challenges I was facing with respect to getting into the Air Force as a pilot, because that on its own is a very tricky, lengthy process. You send your application. Normally what they do is once a year, they advertise in the newspaper. You get the column, you complete the form, then they'll call you in for interviews, or rather psychometrics initially, and then it's the medical exam, and then it's actual interviews. Now, fortunately for me, in that year, it was 2008, it was my matric year, I was fortunate enough to be called into an interview with the military, the Air Force, and on that day, they did all the interviews at once. So in the morning, you'd arrive around 7 in the morning, you did your physical exam, then we did psychometrics, and then eventually there was the one-on-one interview, the panel interview with some former military pilots, as well as current military pilots and human resources. At the time, I was probably 18. I didn't know much about aviation, and unfortunately or fortunately, I did not make it in. And it was from a weird glitch where the post office went on strike around about the time I was supposed to get results. So fortunately or unfortunately, at that point or prior to that, I had already made a decision to say, I'm going to need something as a backup, something to fall back on. And I had started applying into engineering at the University of Witwatersrand. So when I did not get feedback from the Air Force, I realized I'm going to have to find something else to do in the meantime, because finances were not something that was easily accessible. As I mentioned earlier, I can't say that I'm from a well-off background where we had the money lying around to take me through flight school. So for the beginning of it all, which was the real crux of the commencement or the commencement of the journey, was 2008 when I applied to the South African Air Force. Thereafter, I got into engineering to study aeronautical engineering, at which point I realized, after 3 years of the degree, I realized this was not going to work out for me, despite me wanting to have it as a backup plan should the aviation journey not continue as I'd liked. I then applied to South African Airways, which by then, I think it was 2013 into 2014, where by God's grace, I think it's so important to also mention how timing is very important and how God uses our shortfalls to place us in positions that we didn't initially anticipate. So by virtue of having been in university for as long as I was with my transcript, I was able to use that transcript to apply into South African Airways. And I genuinely believe that had I not spent time at Wits University studying towards a degree that I did not complete, because I left the university before I completed, I would not have been able to apply into South African Airways. Again, that was the reason for me applying into South African Airways, was a financial aspect. Again, aviation is relatively expensive. It's not for anybody and everybody. If I can give you a random figure, on average, you're looking at about 3,500 hours per lesson. And that 3,500 hours goes into just getting into the aircraft and flying. There's other costs involved that generally when you're not in the aviation industry, you know nothing about. So when I got into South African Airways in 2014, I was accepted into 43 Air School, which is where I started physically flying an aircraft. And what most people assume is that when you start flying, you start with the simulator. No, you get into an actual aircraft. Some soul has to sit with you and take you off the ground and get you into the sky from lesson number one. So that's what actually makes it very important, expensive, is the mere fact that from day one, you're entering into a physical machine. So there's insurance involved, there's fuel involved, there's the salary of the instructor involved, there's the hangar costs, there's the maintenance costs. So generally, as an average child of the African soil, it's not an industry where one can just get into and assume that their savings of 200,000 will be enough to get them from 0 hours to a commercial pilot's license.
Yeah. Wow. It's interesting how it all, just builds up, like you said, and then there's also remedial classes.
Yes.
It's not every hour that you're going to get from the get-go.
Yes.
Some you're going to need a lot more practice. So that as well. Yeah, that's something. And South Africa has a vibrant aviation community. Like you mentioned, like you had local air shows and sometimes they're fly-ins. So that for you on its own, how would you say that impacted your decision, your early passion?
Fortunately, like I mentioned earlier, the air shows that I was exposed to, and maybe I was naive or just not paying attention, because I had known very, very early on that the industry is predominantly dominated by a certain race and a certain gender. So fortunately for me, every air show that I had attended had a lot of representation. So I didn't really experience or feel initially, anyway, in any event, I didn't really feel the tension or the stress from the perspective that it's a predominantly white, male-dominated industry. Fortunately, at the time, like I'm saying, South Africa was in a very beautiful perspective or beautiful space where they were driving the initiative to get more and more African pilots into the industry. So for me, it was a beautiful crux and a pushing factor that pushed me in that direction to sort of say, okay, this is something that I can actually do and I can actually achieve. And it's not until I was in the industry itself that I realized the challenges. So it wasn't until 2014 where now I was now sitting down and in the industry and getting exposed more and more to the crux and the finer details that I realized actually what I was getting myself into.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, so we'll move on now to career milestones and you being a global dispatch. So you've transitioned from South African skies to global dispatch, a role that's critical, but often behind the scenes. They're not seeing your face. They're not seeing the epaulets on you. Yes. Can you explain what a global dispatcher does and why it is so vital to aviation?
Wow. So prior to becoming a global dispatcher or becoming part of the large group that is global dispatchers, I was a flight instructor for the longest time. And from a perspective of being a flight instructor, you're not really exposed to what actually happens in an organization like an airline or a business aviation. So once you discover the other world, you realize that there's so many other opportunities within the aviation industry other than just an air traffic controller or a pilot. So the transition from being a flight instructor to a global dispatcher has been absolutely astronomical. So what a global dispatcher basically does is that they form part of a group called the Operations Control Center. And within the Operations Control Center, each and every one is part of the global dispatchers. And in that global dispatchers umbrella, you have a crew planner, you have a fleet planner, you have a fact team, and the fact team basically deal with flights there and then or on the day. You've got somebody who monitors the weather, you've got a flight planner, you've got the ground handlers, you've got ground crew, you've got cabin hostesses, you've got the pilots themselves. And all of these people form the heart of aviation or an airline. Without each of these individual global dispatches within the bigger umbrella, the airline cannot function. You cannot take one aircraft from one point to another. So to put it in very simple terms, if I have an aircraft based in Johannesburg, I will need approximately 30 people to be able to get that aircraft to be crewed, to have the passengers in the aircraft, to have tickets issued, to have that flight plan set up and set sufficiently to get that aircraft from Johannesburg to Durban, for instance. And so, like you mentioned, being in the background is nothing like what it would be when you're a pilot, because nobody even knows you exist. Nobody even knows that there's that side of the world where you're actively working with the background of the situation. So global dispatching is actually the heart of aviation. Without that aircraft that we're comfortably walking into and taking off and flying to our destination, it wouldn't work. It would not exist without global dispatch.
Wow, that's so interesting. I like how you mentioned the various careers, because the career that's known most of the time is just the pilot.
Yes.
The others, refuelers, ticket agents, all the others, they all form, it's like a body. You need your legs, arms, the eyes,
all the parts.
So it's not just a pilot, and every department is vital. Yeah,
absolutely.
Wow. Interesting. And what was the biggest challenge you faced moving from local aviation in South Africa to an international role, and how did you overcome it?
For me, the biggest challenge has been the fact that I am no longer flying an aircraft. I'm now expected to sit at a desk for 12 hours straight. That has been the most challenging thing I've had to experience. I mean, when I started flying in 2014, the longest break I've had in my flying career was 3 months, not more than 3 months. I've been at it nonstop since 2014. So 2023 has been potentially the longest break I've had from flying. So taking a break from what I love the most has been challenging, but very crucial in the journey that I'm taking, because the current role that I have is basically a gateway to eventually flying. And the beauty of the organization and the way it's set up, the company I'm currently working for, is that their aim is to groom people from within the organization to eventually get them to flying. So having a background knowledge of what the company does makes it even more beautiful that I'll eventually end up on the flight deck, because then I'll have a beautiful background as to the operations themselves, the ground information, the global dispatch aspect of it, and what actually is needed for me and my tiny portion of getting into the cockpit and flying. I cannot begin to describe how minimal what it is that pilots actually do. And I'm not taking away from the importance of us as pilots. I'm not taking away from the job that we do and how much time and energy and effort it takes to become a pilot, as well as what it requires to actually fly the plane. I'm just putting into perspective what is required to get an aircraft off the ground. So the biggest challenge has literally just been sitting in front of a desk in terms of being welcomed into the organization, in terms of getting comfortable living on the island. The company's been very nurturing. They've been exceptionally nurturing. My colleagues are very nurturing. And another thing is, with aviation, no matter where you are, you will be exposed to all kinds of nationalities. So fortunately for me, from South Africa at 43 Air School at African College of Aviation, where we met, there's just always been a mixture of all kinds of nationalities. So moving from South Africa to Malta, it wasn't too much of a transition in terms of being exposed to people from all over the world. What has been the most challenging is just the work itself, because I've never done it before. I've never had to sit for that long without, and I mean, when I'm flying, I'm sitting, but it's a different kind of enjoyment. It's not the same. It's not the same at all. So the biggest has been literally just having to sit and not be watching the clouds change in front of me.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I was talking to someone the other day, and she's a pilot. Someone, and she's a pilot, and she actually said, I'm just a pilot," because you end up just feeling like you're just a pilot. But if what you've done, yes, you'll be a pilot, but you actually feel better, good, I would say, because you have other skills other than just being a pilot that you have. Yes, because for some people, because it's like you've been flying for 40 years, and all you do is fly, and you don't have other skills, other
and nothing to sort of fall back on. And I think like any task or any job, it would get mundane, no matter how passionate. I know I'm very passionate about flying, but I had gotten to a point with my instructor role where I was feeling like, I'd really love some change. I'd really love something different, something that takes me away from what I'm doing consistently. Because as a flight instructor, you're redoing the same lesson over and over again. What changes, however, is the student, because then from each student, I had to figure out how to convey the message in a way that they understand and in a way that they can keep it stored in their memory for the rest of their lives. Because in as much as it's a non-incredibly paying role to be a flight instructor, it's almost like being a grade 1 teacher. If the foundation is not set up correctly, that pilot is going to have challenges. So in that case, it becomes a case where I was very passionate about instruction. I still am, but I've gotten to a point where I was feeling like, okay, you know what, if it means pivoting just a little bit and not being an instructor for a short while just to get to the next goal, then I'll take that. I'll definitely take that.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah.
So tell us a memorable moment in your career, perhaps a flight you dispatched or a situation where your expertise made a real difference.
Wow. As a global dispatcher, the most recent one, and I can't even say I have expertise. What I can say is that had I been a global dispatcher in South Africa versus in Europe, I believe I would have been more better skilled and more better. I'm still good, well suited for the job, but I would have been more better skilled in the sense that it would have been an area that I'm comfortable in. Now, being a global dispatcher or part of the global dispatching team in Europe, an environment I've never been exposed to, an airspace I've never understood, has had its own challenges. So one of the biggest, I would say, highlights of my career as a crew planner currently was when we had a flight that was needed to go into China, right? And with any flying regulations, there's flight time limitations. So in the flight time limitations, we have 13 hours in a day. You cannot fly more than 13 hours. You have to take into consideration time zone corrections when flying from east to west or west to east. And it's more dramatic if you're flying from east, or rather from west to east. So in this case, we had a flight that was landing in China, and China is very restrictive in terms of who they let fly in and who they let fly out. On average, they require 2 weeks to give us a permit, a parking permit, an overflying permit, as well as a general permit to get into the airport. So we had a tricky situation where our crew that was crewing that specific aircraft at the time had to go into their legal rest. And when I speak of legal rest, I speak from the perspective of working certain number of hours for a certain period. So our crew at that time had worked for 7 days, and in 7 days they had exceeded the minimum number of hours that they could fly. So they needed to take off at a certain time, land in another airport in China, cabotage, and then take off a little bit later. But because of their limitations, they were only able to do the first segment. They couldn't do the second segment for the day. So we needed to arrange a crew change within China, which is impossible, like I mentioned, because they want 2 weeks notice. This is what's going to happen. So with the nature of the business, you don't necessarily have 2 weeks to provide that feedback. What tends to happen is that in the 2 weeks, you might have 700 flights that are inserted in between that flight that should be happening on the 3rd of July, for instance, or you might have no flights. So if the crew for that 7 days has no flights, then it works out perfectly. They're able to do the duty without exceeding their limitations. However, if prior to that flight that's specifically going into China, there's a lot of other sectors that are happening the days before. Of course, their hours are going to accumulate quite rapidly, and eventually they'll get to a point where we're no longer able to keep the crew there and they'll need to be changed. So what happened here was that we couldn't get the aircraft to proceed to another airport, and the crew that was incoming, they were coming in from Europe. As such, they were not able to get direct flights from where they were coming from to this airport where the aircraft was currently positioned. And the nearest airport was about 250 kilometers away or something insane. And they were saying to us, they won't be able to get there on time. So the first task I had was to try and get the crew at the actual airport where they'd be taking off in time and get them permits. Now, the problem with China, they will not give you permits. So I was facing a situation where it was going to be a violation, a legal violation of the other crew, or a legal violation of being in China and the airport telling us they don't want us in that airport anymore, or the issue where the other crew is now spending too much time doing ground travel before they operate a live sector. Again, because it's a very iffy situation, and iffy in the sense that if they're spending too much time doing other work, other duties on the ground prior to the life sector, they'll eventually get to the life sector tired. So there were a lot of moving objects that needed to be sorted out. And every time I was trying to speak to a senior, they were sitting there thinking, okay, we don't know what to do. So eventually, the duty manager, or flight operations manager rather, I went and sat with him and I gave him all the dynamics, and he was throwing me questions, and I was saying, we can't do this because of this, and he asked this question in a sense, we can't do this because of this. And eventually he suggested that I speak to our liaison officer in China. I can't remember his name, Tian. And I spoke to Tian and he said to me, okay, he's going to call the handler in China and we'll see if we can get a permit. And true to form, the handler in China was like, okay, it's fine. We'll let the other crew in so that there can be a crew change. So after that, my next task was now to find flights from Europe that could get this crew in there directly to the airport where the aircraft was currently positioned without them traveling on the ground. Eventually, I managed with the help of the travel department, and we found flights that made everyone happy. The crew change was successful. And I mean, I was on the last day of my shift when all of this was happening. So I wasn't going to be able to find out what the feedback was. So 3-4 days later, I went back to check and it worked out. There was no extension on the duty. They didn't cancel our flight. They didn't cancel our permits. They were okay with the permits. And I think the other challenge was that week, the Chinese civil aviation was closed. I think they were closed until the 6th of the month. I think it was May. And so there was that issue as well, where we can't actually necessarily even get those permits. We have to communicate to somebody to actually eventually get them to do the crew change successfully. The crew change eventually happened and everything worked out perfectly. So that for me was a huge milestone.
Wow. As you were talking, I was just imagining you behind the desk on this phone call, making this and, running up and down.
That's exactly what it was like, where I'm sending emails, I'm calling this person, I'm calling that person. The crew is stressed because the crew themselves as well are always communicating with us consistently about their concerns and what they're worried about. So from a crew planning perspective, which is the role that I have under the umbrella of Global Dispatcher, we play the role of being the therapist, we play the role of being the travel agent, we play the role of making sure that We're making sure that they're meeting the legal limitations of their duty without busting anything. And we're also playing the role of confirming that their health is okay. So if the crew are feeling ill or they're feeling they're not okay or they're suffering from fatigue, we're the first point of contact. And once that call has been made, the next step is to plan and find another crew member to change in that environment. So it's a different ball game altogether. And I've spoken to people who've worked the same role that I have in an airline versus what I'm doing now. And they also do the same thing. It's next level. It's completely different. Yeah, it's completely different.
Mm-hmm. And how has working globally, possibly in Europe, expanded your perspective on aviation compared to your experiences in South Africa? I think this just builds on the question prior. I can imagine different languages also, like China now, Mandarin, and I'm just thinking.
The most interesting thing for me, and this is not even necessarily related to the topic, is the fact that as a South African or as an African in general, we are taught to speak English. Doesn't matter what the situation is, we're only taught to speak English from an early age. You're groomed to say, learn to speak English, learn to speak English. When I arrived in Europe, the shock I had when I realized there was a tiny population named England that spoke English. When you get to a place and you discover Italians do not understand English. The French do not understand English. The Germans, they only speak their mother tongue. And then myself coming from an environment where I consider myself, and I'm considered, I think, by a lot of other people, somebody who's eloquent and someone who can communicate effectively. And you get to an environment and people do not understand you. That is the most shocking.
What?
It's the most baffling.
They told me I was good. I spoke so well.
What is this? And to discover consistently that actually, no, people don't speak the language, and you realize basic terms like hollow, people don't understand. I mean, I had an interesting situation the other day where my colleague said to me, what is that thing that you say is an egg? And I said, hollow. And he said to me, I've never heard that word before. He's Italian. So I thought, what? This is actually incredible. So from an aviation perspective, it's really widened my horizons into understanding what the world actually looks like from an aviation perspective in terms of, one, the operations control center, two, how other organizations actually function aside of the airline environment, and why this particular company is very successful at what it does. Mainly because of the location. I mean, I look at Emirates. Emirates is also very successful at what it does because of where it's located and its access to the world. If you try and run an organization like the one I work for in South Africa, it wouldn't work as well because the costs would just be too sky high. Whereas from this end, flying to other destinations is a lot easier because, one, the market on this end is a lot larger and you have more and more people interested in flying private jets because financially they can actually, they have more reach than anywhere else. That made me realize why a lot of airlines or aviation companies in other parts of the world don't necessarily succeed. It's not always just because the market is not there. Sometimes it's just the location and the locality where you discover financially it just doesn't make sense because the fuel costs just become too expensive, maintenance becomes too expensive, and having a base point where things are located, traveling back to that base becomes a challenge as well.
Wow. Okay, so we'll move on to challenges and resilience. Aviation can be a male-dominated field. Have you faced any barriers as a woman in this industry, and how have you navigated them?
Questions like these are always so challenging for me because I used to look at people who are successful. I'll put it in inverted commas because that term is very broad. And I'd wonder why they always made it look so easy. But in my own specific case, I realized that when you are going through the challenges at that time, and it's very hard and tough, generally we don't expose ourselves as people to show other people what we're going through. So you go through the challenges and you struggle and you come out on the other side. And because you've gone through it and you've healed, it almost always seems like it never existed. And so when you're telling the story now from the other end, you're no longer even remembering the challenges that you face. They're there, they haven't disappeared, you experience them, but now you're on the other end, your remembrance or your view of those challenges is now from a different light, because now you're looking at it from hindsight, and you're like, okay, had I not gone through those challenges, I wouldn't be where I am. So questions like these are always so challenging, because I want to share the reality and the challenges that are actually out there. But sometimes I forget that I actually went through those challenges.
Crossed over.
Exactly. One needs to be very careful when describing it, to not sugarcoat it and make it look like the challenges are not there. Because again, when you're on the side and things are now comfortable and you've worked through the trials, it's easy to forget the struggles that you face. So in my own personal journey, I've had my fair share of ups and downs. One from the male section, two from the race section. As a flight instructor, it has been quite challenging. Majority of the flight instructors that I was exposed to were male. My own flight instructor, when I started my training, was a white male. That created a space where what I understood initially about race and comfort was shifted, because initially I was thinking, everybody's the same, everyone is equal. I went to Wits University. There wasn't a real threat or confusion or any discomfort with respect to race and gender roles until I got into aviation. When I got into aviation, I started seeing how glaring they actually are. A lot of the times I'd find my foreign counterparts, guys from Nigeria, guys from Kenya, people from Namibia, male and female, as soon as they stepped into South Africa, they would be shocked and point out that they didn't realize what racism was until they were in South Africa, until they actually experienced it themselves, and they realized how intense it actually is. So there's a lot of challenges that I've faced within my career prior to becoming a global dispatcher, where I felt ill-treated. I felt the work has to be 10 times more to be able to prove myself in my role, as well as making sure that I am not considered incapable or incompetent based on the fact that I'm a Black female. So there's always been sort of pushing the boundaries, where in flight school, I remember hearing them communicating in Afrikaans, saying that these kids are going to take our jobs. And I didn't understand it at the time, but in hindsight, I realized that the assumption was that because I was being sponsored by a certain company meant that automatically I'd get a job. But now, years later, I have no close contact with this company. I'm not even anywhere near to being hired by the company. So the race and gender challenges specifically in South Africa are still there, and they need to be worked on quite a lot.
Yeah. Okay. And how did you navigate all this so you could actually get your licenses and
I put my head down and I studied. Honestly speaking, it was a matter of just putting my head down and studying. It was hard because if you've not been exposed to it and you didn't grow up in a space where you're conditioned to think that somebody's going to discriminate you because of your race and your gender, when you're finally exposed to it, the assumption is that you're crazy. You might be thinking something that is not. You might be assuming that somebody's out to get you, and maybe you're not. So if you're not exposed to that type of culture, your first reaction is never to say, look, what you're doing is wrong. Your first reaction is never to call it out. Your first reaction is always to sort of question and wonder and say, is this real, or am I going crazy? Until somebody else comes in and validates your experience, then you're able to say, okay, no, what's happening here is incorrect. So it took a while before I was able to get to a point where I was comfortable enough to say, look, this is not how it's going to work. This is what needs to happen in order for me to succeed. So the large portion of it, I can genuinely say I just kept my head down and I studied just to make sure that there weren't barriers. And of course, the barriers are always there. You go through the one hoop, there's another one, and you're just consistently going through the hoops. So I can say that the challenges never really stopped, because there were interviews with airlines that I had where it was very blatant and clear that it was a racially discriminatory incident. And because racism is so insidious in the country, it's difficult once again to be able to pinpoint in a black and white sense to say this was a racial discrimination. It's very undercarpet, very insidious. So it's tricky to sit and be able to say, okay, this is what it is, straightforward, and be able to move on and fight for what is right at that point. So I can say, like I mentioned, just keeping my head down and focusing on what was important and trying to pick my battles and avoiding battles that weren't necessarily going to lead me anywhere, and choosing the battles where I knew, okay, this I can control versus what I can't control.
Yeah, there's a lot of mind working on that you have to, because it's a lot of hearing, you can't. Now having to tell yourself, I can.
Yes.
I'm worthy. Yes. And like you said, you had to study, to prove yourself and to be equally important here. Okay, and imposter syndrome is real for many professionals. Have you ever felt it, and what strategies helped you push through?
I have. I think for the first time in my career, just for the first time as a person, in actual fact, I am able to comfortably say I've gotten to a point where my imposter syndrome is not taking over my existence. And to explain imposter syndrome in the most simple sense is believing you are not meant to be where you are, based on whatever the mind decides. I, for a long time, because I had challenges in flight school, just a brief background, I was kicked out of flight school. I was told I could never fly. I was told I should just forget about it. And again, in hindsight, you realize that it had nothing to do with anything but race and gender. And so having to push through and become a flight instructor made it all the more challenging, because now I am now in a position where I'm supposed to teach someone else. The imposter syndrome came in where I was wondering, am I teaching the correct information? Even though I've sat and I've studied and I know what I'm teaching, and I've been declared and qualified by somebody who's superior to say, yes, you're capable, and this, you're doing a good job at what you're doing. There were a lot of moments where I'd sit and wonder, is this real? Am I really capable of doing this? Or is it a fake version of myself that's displaying themselves to the world to say, yes, I'm confident and I'm capable, whereas in the background, I'm sitting there panicking, wondering if I can possibly pull it off. So it, like you mentioned, it requires a lot of mental tuning and programming to say, yes, you're okay. So imposter syndrome has definitely been there. I can't say I've never experienced it. I have experienced it. And I think now more than ever, I'm in a comfortable space where I'm able to pinpoint what it is I can and I can't do without feeling like an imposter. So comfortably saying this is what I can do and not feeling like I'm not capable. Whereas with imposter syndrome, you were sitting knowing that you can do something, but saying to yourself, it's fake. I'm not this person, or I'm not capable of doing what I'm doing.
Okay. And when we going to the younger viewers, some advice and inspiration for young listeners in Africa dreaming of an aviation career, what's one piece of advice that you'd give to get started, especially if resources are limited?
The biggest advice I would give is to get themselves to a flight school or an airport. The thing, like I mentioned earlier, that kept me going is just exposure every now and again, being in an environment that sort of refuels the excitement, that pushes the passion and gets the passion ignited every now and again. Definitely find flight schools, find airports where there's a viewing deck. Get yourself comfortable with the passion that you are feeling and you're experiencing, so that you expose yourself more and more to what it is that you're desiring to have. What I've noticed with white people, and I don't like making it a racial thing, but genuinely speaking from my own background, what I've noticed with white people is that when they realize that their children are liking something, they try and expose them to that as frequently as possible, from any dimension, even if it means, the family might not necessarily come from a background where they were pilots or anybody involved in aviation, but they make it a point to take their children to spaces where they can expose them to all of these things. So find ways to get to the museum, find ways to get to air shows, find ways to get to flight schools. If you do get to flight school, ask questions, even if you don't know what you're asking, because with an industry like aviation, 90% of the time, you will not know what it is that you want to ask until you're there. So you won't know what you don't know until you're in a space where you're getting exposed bit by bit. So definitely I would encourage young listeners or viewers to find ways to get closer and closer to their passion. For me, another one that I didn't mention was air crash investigation. My grandmother that's her favorite show on the face of the earth. So even when we couldn't attend air shows, we would watch air crash investigation. We would watch 60 Seconds to Disaster, which played a lot of plane crash investigations, which is another element in my career that I found myself passionate in, which is the safety aspect. So had I not been watching those shows consistently, I wouldn't even understand the importance of safety from an aviation perspective.
Amazing. And how can aspiring aviators leverage scholarships or programs like those from Women in Aviation International or the 99s, or ISA Plus 21, which we'll hear about later on in the series. But yeah, how can they leverage on that?
Definitely the leveraging would come from, again, exposure, communicating with people. I think the challenge with information is that there's so much and you don't know what it is that you need to learn or read or discover. So sitting down and finding a mentor for one, another challenging thing, which is why this platform exists, Nyasha, thank you so much for that, is that it puts us in a position where we as people who are in the industry are able to send out our services and get people to be exposed and help them become mentors, or rather have them as mentees and we become the mentors. How they can leverage is definitely learning, read. There's a lot of organizations out there that have funding and bursaries and scholarships that are out there. However, if you are not learning or reading about them, then you won't know how to use them and where to get a hold of them. Some of them require that you become a member. Some of them don't require that you become a member. Some of them exist solely for a certain portion of your training. Some of them don't. But in order for you to be able to leverage from them, you have to know what it is that the organization does. You have to know what it is that you want and what you're after and what you can give and what you can't give in order to be able to successfully obtain the scholarship or the sponsorship.
Okay, thank you. In closing, what's next for you, Palesa? Are there new goals or projects in aviation you're excited about?
Yes. So currently I'm working on my European pilot's license. It is a challenge and a half because I have to write 14 exams to convert my South African pilot's license to a European pilot's license. And the goal or the whole reason behind it was just so that I have better leverage. I mean, if you look at a program called Flight Radar 24, which is another thing that young pilots could actually just look at. You download the app, it's free of charge. You get access to all the flights globally, anywhere in the world at any given time. You're able to track those flights, track what time they take off, what time they land. If you have a look at Flight Radar 24, you will realize that the most flights that occur in the world are in the Europe space. So for me, getting a European pilot's license has been a bigger goal than I actually realized, because I've been wanting to do it for longer than I was aware, or longer than I allowed myself to believe. So right now, what's in the pipeline is definitely getting that license and eventually flying business jet aircrafts. That's the game plan currently.
That's awesome. And any final words of inspiration for our audience aiming to soar beyond their borders?
Absolutely, guys. Don't take the small roles for granted. Don't look them and look down upon them. I started my flight training in 2014. At some point, I worked as an operations clerk. And operations clerk is basically on a smaller scale what I'm currently doing now. But having been exposed to that small scale operations work is what also allowed me to understand and realize that there's a bigger scale of operations that actually is involved within the aviation industry. So when we speak about chasing your goals, or not chasing, maybe following your dreams and being in pursuit of your dreams, there's so many ways of doing it. There's a lot of success stories of people who worked as dispatchers, ticket agents, cabin hostesses before they became pilots. You don't have to have one-dimensional pathway. And I know a lot of us think that life is just linear, but life in general for anybody in any industry is scribbles. You start here, then you go there, then you go there, and you go up and you go down. And before getting to where I am now, I was under the impression that everybody's journey is very linear, but you discover the more you get exposed to people within all kinds of industries, not just aviation, that they start somewhere, there's a break, there's a pause, there's funds that they don't have, they need to go into a different path before they get to where they want to go. So the whole journey is what's important and not necessarily the destination, and enjoy the journey so that you don't start despising the destination once you get there.
Oh, thank you. Palesa, thank you so much for this. This is just the first series. We're going to have many more. Maybe we can meet up someday and actually have a proper sit down and there's still lots more to talk about. And
absolutely,
thank you so much for taking time out and joining us and inspiring Africa.
Yeah, you're most welcome. It's been an utmost pleasure. And I think conversations like these are so necessary to be had, because like I mentioned, when you're actually living the experience, you don't realize all the things that are involved unless you're having a conversation about it. And we don't have conversations like this very often. So every now and again, sitting down and having chats just so that somebody who's not exposed to what's happening can get an idea is the most important thing, because you each, what do they say? What's the saying? Teach one, reach one, or something along those lines. The journey becomes more fulfilling if somebody else is touched along the way.
Oh, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you, Nyasha.
Thank you.